Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the 7th annual Sheng lecture series here at FSU. It's my pleasure and great honor to introduce to you Dr. Robert Ford Campany, our guest speaker for today. I've been an admirer of his work for many years, as my grad students know. If I were to capture his work, even though he may not agree, but if I were to do it, I would say his work historicizes the Chinese early medieval imaginaire and of the cosmologies, ideologies, and sanctity. He works a lot with hagiographic literature. By imaginary, of course, I don't mean to suggest anything that's false, but what I mean is a kind of shared norms, values, practices, and so on, that are instituted textually, visually, and orally. And he brings all these things in conversation with the study of religion, some of the questions, problems that scholars of religion in general address. So his work is intrinsically interdisciplinary, and he's able to speak across disciplinary fields. After attaining his PhD in 1988 from the University of Chicago, Dr. Campany began his career at Indiana University. He stayed there for about 18 years. And he moved on to University of Southern California for briefly for 4 years, before in 2010 at Vanderbilt, where he's currently professor of Asian religions and religious studies. During these years, he has authored close to 50 articles, many of which, of course, deals with Chinese religious practice in the medieval period, but also deals with broader theoretical issues in religious studies in general. He has published, for example, in the journal Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. And also during this time of his 5 book manuscripts and 2 edited volumes, each of these have made significant contribution to our field. To name a few, he has translated and wrote extensive commentary to the most important early medieval hagiographic collection concerning the types of Daoist holy persons known as transcendents, or Sheng. This is in the work To Live as Long as Heaven and Earth. His other works, such as Making Transcendence, is a further examination of hagiographic literature, seeing them through the lens of as artifacts of collective memory. He has applied this model of collective memory or repertoire theory to see the practices and norms, and also Buddhist studies. So the book Signs from the Unseen Realm, Buddhist miracle tales from early medieval time, is the first complete Western language translation of one of the largest collection of miracle tales that circulated among Buddhist clerics and laity in the medieval period. His new book, 6th book, The Chinese Dreamscape, 300 BCE to 800 CE, is a thematic study of dreaming, dream interpretation, and visionary narratives. Today's talk is drawn from his 7th book project. The 6th one will be coming out in October. And this one is called Dreaming and Self-Cultivation in China, 300 BCE to 600 CE. And it's a study of multiple rules of dream in the lives of practitioners of various kinds, Buddhist, Daoist, otherwise, and rhetorical uses of dreaming and religious ideals in text. So he's a master of the unseen arts, hagiographic literature, and also how people imagined, cultivated, and shaped their lives around this shared repertoire of ideas in the Chinese religious landscape. So please join me warmly in welcoming Dr. Campany.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me in the back? I may end up ditching this jacket. I want to begin by thanking the Sheng Education Foundation for making this trip possible, and Florida State University, of course, the Department of Religion, its faculty and students, and especially my old friend and colleague, Yu, who for some reason thought this would be a good idea. I guess someone else backed out or something. So you're stuck with me. But I want to do 4 things today in about 45 to 50 minutes. I hope if I go past 50, someone make a sign and I'll just stop, even if I'm in the middle of something. I want to talk about the larger project of which today's materials are examples. Second, I want to zero in on 2 aspects of that larger project. Third, 2 texts, each of which exemplifies one of those aspects, one Taoist and one Buddhist. And then to conclude, a few sort of back of the napkin thoughts that I've had in the last day or two on how these texts might be compared, what we might think or say about them. That part's the roughest and most preliminary of all. So, as Jimmy mentioned, I have this book, Chinese Dreamscape. It's coming out from Harvard in October. My project here was to carry out what I call mapping of the dreamscape of China during this long period. What I mean by this is something like Jimmy himself used the term imaginary, which, as many of you know, we these days often use as a noun to, I guess, translate this imaginaire, this French word, which just means sort of the total array of things that people thought dreams were, what people did with dreams, how they responded to them, how they theorized on the basis of them, carried out plans of action on the basis of them, or nipped their plans, cut off their plans maybe if they decided because of a dream that they were a bad idea, whether dreams mean anything, and if so, how and why, and how we might find out what their secret meaning is. So that's what I tried to do in that book. I have a follow-up project which focuses in tightly on the relationship between these 2 things, between self-cultivation on the one hand and dream experiences on the other. Now this is a strange conjunction of phenomena, I think. Dreams and disciplines are 2 words that we seldom find in the same sentence for good reason. Dreams are other. Dreams have anomalousness built into them in ways that I'm sure I don't need to explain. We can interact in our dreams with people that have long been dead, or animal friends that we have had. We can encounter people now old as young again. We can ourselves be different ages in our dreams. You can dream of yourself as a child doing something. Various things impossible in waking life. Flying being an example, unless perhaps, or maybe it is possible to fly in waking life, but I haven't yet mastered that technique myself. And even when a dream is mundane, as I guess most dreams are, there's that strange jolt of waking up to find that you were only dreaming. This experience that you were having is suddenly cut off, and you're in a different world, and you're wondering, it often takes us a moment to reset our minds, I think, when that happens. So, that's dreaming. But on the other hand, think about the practitioners of any of the multiple paths of self-cultivation. This is a very general term that I'm using here to stand for a very large range of practices and goals. These were disciplines meant to bring all aspects of experience, or at least many of them, under some sort of control. Daily, these men and women that this book is going to be about took up practices aimed at disciplining their minds, their bodies, diet, their speech, their senses, their thoughts, their appetites, desires, in some cases even their breathing. As Confucius the character of Confucius is said to have put it in the Analects, what isn't in accord with the rites, well, by which I think he meant this entire body of disciplines. Don't look at, don't listen to, don't do. In what ways then did practitioners try to assimilate dreams' alterity, making their nocturnal experience work for them, or at least fencing off its potential danger? In the project, this fundamental tension is what I will be exploring from multiple angles, looking at various types of texts, various traditions, and several centuries. My questions are basically ones such as these. Again, still talking in general terms about this project. For any given text, what should the practitioner regard dreams as being in the first place? Is it a mental event, as we often, I think, in this society imagine dreams to be? Is it a demonic assault? A divine visit? A soul journey? A sign of chi imbalance in oneself? An index of karmic status? For that matter, what is the nature of the self under cultivation in the first place? And how does that theory of self or idea of self relate to a theory or idea about what dreaming is? What attitude should the practitioner adopt toward dreams? Ignore them? Interpret them? Act on them somehow? Record them? Tell them to others or keep them secret? Look up their meaning in a manual designed for the purpose? How should the practitioner respond to the dream? Or what, if anything, should she or he do with it? How does the dream impinge on, disturb, reflect, or relate to the practitioner's disciplines of self-cultivation during waking hours? Is the dream an unwelcome distraction from cultivational pursuits? Might it sometimes result from and extend those pursuits? Reading through the archive of relevant texts, I found a small number of recurrent paradigms. I'm not completely happy with the word paradigms because it sounds a little too neat or something, too form, too final, but anyway, maybe I'll come up with a better word. But what I mean by these paradigms is just clusters of attitudes and practices, each based on answers to these questions that I just laid out. And I intend these as flexible and heuristic, not ends in themselves, not taxonomy for its own sake. And I just want to stress that this mapping that I've done is, I think of it as a product of my reading through the sources, not a sort of typology that I got from somewhere else and imposed on the sources. So it's there in the sources, but it's also my creation based on what I read in the sources. So it's sort of a made thing, if you will, but it's not it's a made thing, but hopefully not an arbitrarily imposed thing, if that makes any sense. All right, so in the book that's coming out this fall, I came up with the first 5 of these paradigms. The 6th one is one I'll be dealing with in this book to come. Let me just run through these very, very quickly. Filtering. Often dreams were seen as, particularly nightmares, odious dreams. In Chinese is the most common term for these. The word nightmare itself, of course, has an interesting history. We won't get into that. But so here it's either what to do after you've had a nightmare, or how to prevent nightmares at all. And nightmares, there's a language in which these are described that really portrays them in terms of impurity and yuckiness. You know, they're sort of, as a self-cultivator, whatever your goal is and whatever your practices are, you're trying to kind of purify yourself. And nightmares mess that up really bad. So, you know, you might dream, for example, of engaging in actions that are completely forbidden to you in your waking life. And so that's a problem that you have to deal with. So that's one paradigm. Another is to seek dreams out, dreams designed to answer your questions or address your concerns, practices of incubation. These were ubiquitous across the ancient world. I think we see a little less evidence for them in this period in China, but there is evidence, both Daoist and Buddhist, that I found. And I'm going to talk about that in this project, although not today. Visitation, this one probably self-explanatory. The dream is imagined as an encounter with some actual other being who comes to see you. It might be a god, it might be a dead friend. It might be a demon, but maybe sometimes, you know, demons don't just need exercising, they sometimes come to help you in some unexpected way. So all kinds of possibilities there. Not dreaming, as some of you know, one goal of Taoists, for example, was not to dream at all. And I'll talk about the reasons why that was the case and methods for avoiding dreaming. But also just the whole argument about, you know, what dreams are and why, therefore, we should try not to have them if possible. What dreams mean? And usually the answer to that is, and I'm thinking here specifically of texts like the Zhuangzi and the Vietza, dreaming is mental perturbation. You dream when your mind is disturbed or touched by something. It's like a ripple effect, a stone dropped in water, and the dream is the waves on the water. You don't want that. You want a calm, clear, empty mind. And so you want to shut dreaming down for that reason. Today, I'm going to be zeroing in on these 2 paradigms, what I call spillover and diagnosis. And so let me say a few words about those. Spillover, basically, see where I am in my slides. Yeah, there we go. The reason I call this spillover is that the dream here is imagined as a direct continuation of work that you're doing while awake. You just keep doing it while you dream. So, the dream is just simply an extension of your waking concerns and daily practice. It is often thought of as an index of the quality of your daily practice. In other words, if you have cultivation-related dreams at night, it's a sign that you're doing your daytime waking practice correctly and with the appropriate intensity and dedication, so that you never really stop cultivating yourself, even when you're asleep. It sounds exhausting, but we see a lot of this sort of thing. Here's a couple more important, maybe more important and more interesting aspects of this paradigm. These dreams are direct. And what I mean by that is that you have some experience or encounter that is not understood as a code for something else. It just is an experience you have, just like meeting someone in your waking world or having an experience in your waking world. Dreams are not symbols or signs or something needing decoding. They are what they appear to be on the surface. So that's that. They are not images or correlates. This is a very interesting term, Sheng. They're not that. And the dream itself has what I call a performative character. And by that I mean a couple things. The dream actually accomplishes something. It changes the dream in some way. It has a result that carries back into waking life. And what I mean by it also is that the dreamer here, in effect, we could say, remains in character during the dream. So that you're not, like, you could imagine easily a scenario where I might be a self-cultivator during the day, but at night, I just dream of these random things that have nothing to do with my waking self-cultivation. That's not what these dreams are like. In these dreams, you're still the self-cultivator in the dream, in your encounter with whatever happens in the dream. So that's the spillover paradigm. A few examples before I get into the examples I'm going to focus on today. These were pulled, not at random, of course, but there's a wide selection of stuff I could have used here. Confucius himself, in the Analects, is represented in a pretty well-known line as lamenting. He's like, I must be falling off in my practice because I haven't dreamed of the Duke of Zhou in such a long time. A less well-known, but I think even more interesting passage on the same idea is this one from the Lu Shi Chunqiu, which may actually predate that Analects line. We usually think of the Analects as, early 5th century BCE text written by Confucius's disciples. And Mick Hunter at Yale has, I think, put a nail in the coffin with that view of what the Analects is. I recommend to you his book, Confucius Beyond the Analects. So Analects is probably a Western Han text, if that means anything, maybe 2nd century BCE. So this passage, if that's correct, actually predates that Analects line. But here, it's Confucius, but also Mozi and another much less well-known figure, Ning Yue, are portrayed in the same way. The point is that they worked so hard and so intently during the day that at night they would sort of continue their work and be rewarded for it by being visited by the masters, sages, that they were trying to emulate and whose examples they were studying and trying to imitate during the day. And notice that it's not just that the exemplar just appears in a dream and sort of waves and says, how you doing? It's, you get to ask them questions. And this is a modality of dreaming that is that will carry over. We'll see also in some Buddhist texts. So it's quite a powerful thing. You're spending your whole life trying to emulate a sage that's been dead for hundreds of years. But then at night you might have a face-to-face interview with that sage. And maybe get advice, points of correction, evaluation of how you're doing, anything, quite a powerful idea of what dreaming is and why it matters. And then whoever compiled this text, well, we actually know quite a lot about who compiled it, but that's not my subject today. They felt it necessary to tack on this warning. People say, if you focus enough during the day, then at night the spirits will come and inform you. We would like you to know that isn't real. There aren't actually spirits who come and inform you in the dream. It's just a result of your own energy, as it were, your own practice. Buddhist examples, I apologize to those of you who don't read Chinese, but I'm going to tell you what this says so you don't have to worry about it. I designed some of these slides initially for a very different audience. Anyway, the famous Buddhist text, Perfection of Wisdom, I think, quite early, as you see, this is probably one of the earliest Chinese translations of Lotus Sutras that we have. And it's a pretty famous passage where the text is basically telling you, if you do the practice that I am prescribing for you, and if you do it with the appropriate intensity and dedication, then you will be visited by Buddhas. And don't worry, you'll have a vision, in other words. You'll have The Buddha will appear before you, and you will be in the audience, and you'll get to ask the Buddha questions. And if this doesn't happen in your waking life, it will surely happen in your dreams. This is quite a promise. And again, you can ask them questions. These Buddhas you get to hear preached and intoned, recited sutras that you do not yet know of in waking life, so you're actually furthering your knowledge in the dream. Again, it's not just a stamp of approval or something. You're moving forward and making progress in your sleep. So that's that text. A chapter of the Lotus Sutra, a very different kind of Buddhist text, translated also quite early. This translation happens to be a little later. Jiva's in the early 5th century, if I recall. Quite a remarkable passage, often passed over. It's only in the verse portion of this chapter, the Comfortable Conduct chapter of the Lotus Sutra. The promise here is, if you venerate this sutra, and that is the number one practice that the Lotus Sutra constantly is pushing on its readers to do. Venerate me, copy me, preach me, make sure everybody knows about me, keep me set on a high, dry place, never let me fall in the mud, always burn incense when you open a copy of me, etc., etc. And if you do all this, you will have all these wonderful results, which this chapter is going on and on about. And then among the results, sort of slipped in there, is something like this. In your dreams, you will see only cool stuff. The Dan there, that is very strong. It's like, you won't have nightmares, you won't have any irrelevant or trivial or confounding dreams. You will only have dreams in which you are a Buddhist practitioner. But it goes beyond that. It goes on to promise you will yourself emulate and follow the career path of all Buddhas. And you will see yourself transforming into a Buddha in your dream. Toward the end, you will sit and preach the Dharma before an audience, just as all Buddhas do. And at the end of your career as a Buddha, you will be, your body will be, after you've been to Nirvana, your body will be cremated and your relics distributed. So you're living the life of a Buddha, a living Buddha in your dreams. It's a remarkable promise to readers of the Lotus Sutra. I've read the Lotus Sutra many times, and so far I've got to tell you this has not happened to me, so I'm obviously slacking off in my practice. But anyway, that's a spillover paradigm. The other paradigm I'm going to be talking about today is something I call the diagnostic paradigm. Here, the dream content often is a set of messages about yourself. It's maybe not from yourself, but it's definitely to you and usually about you. It is often, it takes the form of a kind of progress report or evaluative pause, and a look at where you are and what you need to do next. Maybe there's an obstacle that's holding you up that you need to deal with, and these are the things that are addressed in this kind of dream. And this is necessary in all texts I found in this paradigm. There's elements of you or your practice that you don't fully grasp or that are unknowable to you. For example, as we'll see, something you did in a past life. You don't know that. But it might be shown to you in a dream. And then you have a way to, once knowing what it is, you have a way to do something about it. If you don't know about it, you can't fix it. So that's why I call this diagnostic. But interestingly, for some reason, these texts also present dreams in an indirect fashion, meaning usually in this paradigm, well, this is the paradigm. If this feature I'm about to mention doesn't hold, then it's some other paradigm. In this paradigm, the dream is a code. So this is a way of thinking about what dreams are that many of us in this room are probably familiar with. Yeah, when you dream of X, it's not about X. X stands for something else. Maybe childhood trauma, maybe a bit of undigested cheese or something if you're eating Scrooge, whatever the case. The dream on its surface is not it's not the actual message of the dream. And so you have to have a way of decoding what is the message of the dream. And texts of this sort typically are the keys to that interpretation. That's what the text is for. That's the work that it does. And so, in some dream interpretation is required, and the text gives you the way to do that. All right. Oh, a few examples, other examples of this paradigm before we get into the two texts I'm going to focus on. Here's a medical example. You dream of certain things. It means that the chi in your body is, there's too much of it in one area or too little of it in another area. You need to apply acupuncture in such a way that the deficient chi is restored, or the excessive chi is sort of drained off, so that it's no longer causing you a problem. Your dream life is a set of signals to you, if you know how to read the signals, about what's going on in your otherwise inaccessible inner self in terms of chi distribution and function, and also a set of things that are implied as to what to do. So it's diagnostic, also therapeutic. And sometimes you see this and sometimes you don't. There's a built-in theory of what causes the dream in the first place. So here it's like somehow chi phenomena in you generate, by a mechanism that's not explained but it's presumed, generate a certain kind of dream. All right, so that's a medical case. Here's a Daoist who are worried about the sort of bio-spiritual parasitic beings that live in us from the time of our conception in our mother's wombs, and that will live in us throughout our whole lives unless we take measures to expel them. And sometimes these are known as the three corpses. And they're just as disgusting as that sounds. And so a lot of methods for getting them out of you forever. But here, this kind of text is basically saying, dreaming of X means that the three corpses are doing Y inside you. And so A, you still have the three corpses. E, you might want to take care of those because your dreams might get worse. The corpses might get more and more active and more aggressive against you. They want to kill you off as early as possible, even though they're temporary home, because once they're no longer bound to your body, they get to run around loose in the cosmos, stealing sacrificial offerings meant for other beings and just causing havoc in a more unchained sort of way. We have this idea going back to Gohong's writings in 317. This particular text, however, is a bit later. Okay, so I'm going to focus today, having laid out this kind of early level landscape of options, on two texts, each exemplifying these two paradigms that I've just gone through. The diagnostic paradigm, we'll be talking about a Buddhist text having to do with the decoding of dreams. This text exists in Tibetan, Brian and I were talking about this, and in Chinese, and I don't know, I don't think a Sanskrit version of it survives. I may be wrong about that. And then for the spillover paradigm, we're going to be talking about a Daoist text from the Sheng tradition, for those of you for whom that means something. Quite a dramatic story unfolds in this text, as we'll see. Both of these texts probably written, well, I know for sure the second one, written in the early 6th century. In the case of the Buddhist text, we know that it existed in Chinese at least by the year 598, because that's the year in which a catalog was written that survives, that mentions this work. All right, so to take the Buddhist text first, this is Bodhi in 713, southern Indian monk, arrives in the capital of China at the time, Chang'an, and Luoyang, a nearby city. He arrives there, in 693. In 713, he completed a supervision of the translation and assemblage of a large collection of mostly Mahayana material sutras known as a group as the Heap of Jewels, the Ratnakuta in Sanskrit, the Da Baoqi Jing in Chinese. And all of the texts have in common the Bodhisattva path, different aspects of it. I guess they're all, must be all Mahayana texts and not just some. So in among these many texts is this one on dreams. Its translation is attributed to Dharma going all the way back to around 300 CE, but there's no reason to think that this attribution is correct. But in any case, as I said, we know that it was circulating in Chinese at least by the year 598. What is this text? It contains an extensive system for dream-based self-diagnosis by Buddhist practitioners understanding themselves to be on the Bodhisattva path toward Buddha. That's what it's intended for. It's not meant for general readers. It's not even meant for all Buddhists. It's meant for specifically for Buddhists who have taken the Bodhisattva vow and who understand themselves to be in training to become a future Buddha themselves. The text lists 108 dream signs, or Lakshana, Sheng in Chinese, and it lists their meanings. After the standard sort of sutra setup, where you have the Buddha preaching to an audience, someone asks a question, he starts discoursing to answer the question. The sutra is the record of his answer to the question. The text opens by simply listing out these 108 signs without any commentary, just a list of the signs, 108. Maybe that's almost like a, come to think of it, that may be intended as a table of contents. You might say, okay, the one I'm looking for is way down near the bottom, so I'll flip back toward the back of the text to find that particular sign, singular one time. Then follows the main body of the text, in which each sign is decoded to indicate the particular point on the 10-stage Bodhisattva path that the dreamer has reached, as evidenced by the dream itself. Following each of these diagnoses, in many cases at least, is a prescription of things to do to remove whatever karmic blockage is evidenced by the dream, so that the practitioner can no longer be held up by this blockage, but can continue moving down the path. Now, the text we have in the Sino-Japanese canon is a little bit messy, as they often are, but you can certainly clearly discern the working principles involved. Many of the dream signs have to do with Buddhist practice or teaching, but some do not. The sutra's main functions are diagnostic and therapeutic. The key information included in each of the 108 diagnoses is which stage of the standard 10-stage path the dreamer has reached currently. Most diagnoses also, interestingly, allow that the dreamer might be in any one of several stages, up to and sometimes including all 10. In other words, if I dream of X, I need more information before I can tell, whether X means I'm at stage 1 or I'm at stage 10 or anywhere in between. And in such cases, further details are given to sort of fine-tune the diagnosis for yourself. For example, if you dream of being a king, okay, that's one sign. You look it up, that's number 90. If you're scoring at home, number 90. And so, dream of a king. I'm a king. Okay. If you're frightened in a dream, when you're a king, this indicates that you're on the first stage of the Bodhisattva path. You're still on a very long way to go. If you're visiting a monastery in the dream as a king, you are at the second stage. If you're sightseeing in a lovely park, that's stage 3. If you're close to gods, that's stage 4. If you're visiting a large city, that's the 5th stage of the path, and so forth. I'll give you another example. That's not the whole text, actually, but that's a pretty big chunk of it, and then I'm going to zero in on the part there that you see in yellow. Just another example. You dream of you're in a Bodhi mandir. You're in some sort of place of worship and practice. Okay, that's the sign. So then, more detail. If you're in that place, but you don't see any trees around you, stage 1, bad news for you. And I'm going to skip over most of these, we'll be thankful for that. But to get down here, if you see a lot of flowers and leaves, all attached to where you would expect them to be attached to, stage 5, and then we go on down and we get to final stage, stage 10, if in addition to all the previous 9 conditions, you also see, celestial beings scattering flowers, and you hear happy sounds of chanting and singing, and people talking about the Dharma, then you're at stage 10. That's really excellent. But the interesting thing is not everybody okay? All right. Does not stop at diagnosis. I mean, it would be quite interesting if that were all this text contains, but it has more. It extends to etiology and the prescription of therapies. So explanations are provided in many cases. If you have a certain karmic obstruction or blockage, this is Yejang Chinese karma varna or nivada. I'm probably butchering the Sanskrit, in which I was never trained properly. Your dream is a manifestation of this karmic roadblock, this elephant in your karmic living room that's sitting there waiting for you to deal with it before you can make more progress. So, examples. If you dream of sitting atop Mount Sumeru, for example, this is sign 68 if you're storing at home. This indicates an insufficiency of karmic merit that's caused by your having befriended evil persons, cultivated wickedness, and ignored the advice of good friends in past lives. In other words, that's my sign. To see yourself at the top of a mountain, sign 69, indicates you have disrespected preachers of the Dharma in a past life. To dream of seeing oneself speared with filth, an especially inauspicious sign, that's number 89. This indicates you have maligned the Buddha and habitually practiced evil deeds in past lives. These etiologies are familiar from other Buddhist texts, including some other sort of Buddhist divination manuals, not based on dreams, like the Consecration Sutra, a so-called apocryphal sutra that was written, I think, initially in Chinese, but based on Buddhist ideas. The 6th century Sutra for Divining Retribution for Good and Bad Karma. There's a scholar in Germany working on this text in particular. In fact, I think that's Christina here. Yeah, hi, Christine. Esther Maria Gudinos, I think. Okay, you know her. Then some karmic obstructions, and this was new to me, actually. I've been teaching about Buddhism, although I'm not usually much of a practitioner of Buddhism, I confess, but I've been teaching about it for decades, and I didn't know until I read this text that some karmic obstructions are not due to your own misdeeds in past lives, at least not directly, but they are due to demons who are messing with you. And they're messing with you because, they don't, just like Mara came on the night of Gautama Buddha's enlightenment, just before he became Gautama Buddha, and tried to divert him from his goal and tempt him away and scare him and so forth, and none of that worked. That's what these demons are doing to you through your dreams. And so there's also ways to diagnose that and then to deal with that. So this is demonic karma, which I'd never heard of. And then I learned there's just 2 years ago or so, some young, I assume he's young, young man in Oslo defended a master's thesis on precisely this topic on demonic karma. So I've learned a lot. Anyway, so then it doesn't stop there either. The text goes on further to recommend practices to remove any of these kinds of obstacles, including the demonic ones. So sign 73, for example, where you dream of mounting a dragon or an elephant, there's a textual variant, specifies that the bodhisattva should cultivate reverence and generosity and avoid delusion and falsehood, and so forth. So, that's this Buddhist text on which I've spent plenty of time. Let me now talk about this Taoist text. And there's a lot of background that, if I had time, would probably help you understand better the import of what I'm going to say about it, but I don't really have time to get there. So this is an early 6th century text. It is a record of the dreams and waking visions of a young man named Zhou over about a 14-month period, leading up to his death. The record stops about 3 months before this, but on 6th December 516, this 19-year-old young man committed suicide by alchemical elixir and died within minutes of taking the elixir, making it intake. The notes that he left were partially recovered by his master, Tao Hongjian, a very famous Daoist gentleman of this time. Also, Tao Hongjian had also taken Bodhisattva vows, by the way. If you're wondering, how is this possible? It happens all the time. Religions are repertoires. You can participate in it anyway. Not surprising, except on these sort of Protestant model religions where you're only supposed to belong to one at a time, and religions are imaged as containers, and you have to jump from one to the other. Tao Hongjian didn't have that word. Anyway, Tao Hongjian compiled these fragments, put them in chronological order, added his comments and annotations. In 4 scrolls, he submitted this document to the Emperor of China at the time, Liang Di. Presumably, maybe it's been speculated to, the Emperor was interested in elixirs of immortality. And one theory as to what Tao Hongjian was doing here, he's being a good subject and reporting this event to the throne, but there's the implicit function maybe of this text as a warning against the emperor. Do not engage in alchemy lightly because it will kill you. And we know actually that several historical emperors in the Tang and probably earlier died because of elixir poisoning. So it's not just like this abstract idea people were actually brewing things up and drinking them, and some of them will kill you. It's now preserved in the Taoist canon, has 109 entries, 49 of those are dream records. Now, 4 quick points about this. Interestingly, the young man, Zhou labeled clearly whether each one was a dream or a waking vision. So that seems to have mattered to him, or thought it would matter to his teacher, once his teacher found these records. But we don't, if you look at like the content, the tone of these 2 sets of entries, they're exactly the same. I can find no difference in who appeared or what kind of content was delivered in the dream. So what happens in these dreams is, I should explain, he'll just say, on night such and such in the calendar, so-and-so came to my room and said the following, and I responded this, and then and all these beings are gods and goddesses, coming to instruct him or evaluate him, often to harangue him. Like this, I have an example coming up. This one. Oh no, that's not it. This one, yeah. Usually they're like, why aren't you working harder? What are you doing? You're wasting time. You're fooling around. You have naked children living in your community, running through your quarters. We can't have that. That's impurifying your self-cultivation living space. You've got to seal those doors and keep those kids out of here. You're too close to your father's tomb that you're digging, and you don't need to dig a new tomb for him anyway, because we've taken care of it. His body, is hundreds of miles away, and you're worried about that. But stop worrying about it and focus on what you're supposed to be doing in your practices, which I haven't even told you what they are, but that's okay. Maybe it's not okay, but I don't have time. But so, this is one thing that one of these gods says to him at one point: if you want to become immortal, why aren't you practicing the things that will lead to that goal? What are you doing wasting so much time? These are direct encounters, with one interesting exception. He has a dream one day of cutting up some goose fat, or goose meat. Maybe he was making foie gras or something. And then he wakes up and he adds the note, I don't know yet what this meant. That's the only one where it's not just a record of a conversation with a known individual, a divine individual. And he's puzzled himself by, and somehow that little note survives, which is nice. But these are interactive encounters, so he's not just witnessing something as if it's on a screen. He's having a dialogue with the divine beings that are visiting. Okay. Now, I want to finish with some, and these are literally back of the envelope. I've got about 8 minutes to do this. That should be fine. 4 points, very preliminary. Regarding the diagnostic versus the spillover paradigms, the dreams in each case, I think, it's important to see have different relationships to the waking world. In a diagnostic situation, that paradigm, the dream is information about the world. It sort of operates at a meta level. It's a comment in code on something in life. It doesn't change life. It might change you, but it doesn't change events. It's a clue to you about the direction of events and so forth. Whereas a spillover paradigm dream, face-to-face contact, and the dream itself is an event in the world, just like as if you were awake. Now, both, of course, change the practitioner and have impact in the waking world if you respond to the dream as something that you should pay attention to. But here's what I think is most interesting. Despite this difference in the relationship between the dream and the waking life, in both cases, the dream is framed as arising from the dreamer's performance of a religious role with defined characteristics. The dream is seen to have arisen from this performance of the role and to be recursively commenting on and evaluating and furthering that performance. So the dream is put to work, in other words, to further the practitioner's goals. And this seems to me the most basic move that these texts and the practices underlying them make with regard to the relationship between dreams and self-cultivation. But wait, there's more. Second point. What was the problem that each of these texts was created to solve? I sometimes teach my students, it's helpful, I think, to think of religious stuff as answering 3 questions. What's the problem? What's the ideal that we should, what would it look like, in other words, if we didn't have that problem? What's the alternative state? And then what's the way to get from the problematic present to a better future where the problem is being removed? And I take this typology, by the way, from a book that I saw on your shelf today in your office, Winston Davis Dojo. He lays out some ideas like this. And ever since I read that book in grad school, I thought this is just a simple but a really useful, powerful set of simple questions to ask about. It could be a text, or it could be a ritual, or a behavior, a practice, a story, anything. So in the Buddhist case, the problem is the opacity of one's previous lives and one's karmic balance sheet, if you will. This past karma, the problem, as many of you know, you have all this karma from previous lives. It weighs on you like a sea anchor, but you don't know what it is. Unless you have recourse to some divination method, or this kind of dream way of getting at that, or some other mysterious access to it. Normally, for most people, we don't have a memory of our past lives, unless we're very, very advanced practitioners, or indeed Buddhas ourselves. And so there's the potential that, 5 lives ago you were a Buddha murderer, but you don't know. Imagine the anxiety that must have created for people. So you are trying to sever those bonds, cut the sea anchor, but you don't know how to do that unless you know specifically. Like you can amass merit, sure, and that's good. That's what most Buddhists have done for centuries. Is I don't know what my karma is, but let me just keep cranking out that merit, keep doing the deeds that earn me merit, so that whatever my karma is, it can be gradually kind of paid down by my meritorious deeds. But here you're trying to be more targeted and proactively specific. For the Taoist, I think the opacity was the other way around. In fact, the opacity here was the young man's own secretive conduct. That in the text, Tao Hongjing, the master, describes his odd behavior. Like people saw the young man doing this or doing that. He requested permission to build a separate little hut to live in and meditate in, some distance away from the main settlement on the mountain. And people didn't know why. And they just, a number of ways that I don't have time to go into. He was just seen acting strangely, and he was puzzling people. And then once Tao Hongjing got hold of these records, which until then had been secret, then he understood what the young man had been about. And so I think perhaps, and this is a very long story, but the young man actually burned some records that are just gone, but he also let an assistant see him burning them. So there's what I call the esoteric dynamic where he's showing people that he had some secret stuff written down, but he's not showing them what the secrets were, but he allowed himself to be seen burning the stuff. And then in the case of this dream record, he did not burn it, he deliberately left it intact, but he hid it in a mountain cave nearby. But it was a mountain cave where he probably knew his master would go looking for stuff. And indeed, that's where his master found this bundle of records. So, in effect, I think Chotsu was explaining himself through this record to his teacher, his family, his own mother and aunt. His mother, he died in her arms on 6th December. His younger brother came and he saw that something was cooking in a little stove and a little fire. And the brother ran and got the mother and the aunt. And by the time they got back to the young man's little hut, he was already lying on the floor, dying. His mother picked up his head, jostled his cap loose, and his last words were, don't cry out and don't make a fuss, you will ruin everything. And he fixed his cap back straight, and then he died in his mother's arms, 19. And one of the readers, of course, of this self-explanatory, disjuncted narrative was the emperor himself, sitting here. So Chotsu too was trying to settle bonds, mostly bonds with his own family. Again, a topic I don't have time to get into here, but in Taoism and Chinese religion generally, there's something like karma, but it's much worse because you can be affected by the karma, in effect, of a family member or of a spouse. You don't even have to have done anything evil in a previous life yourself. You can have an uncle or great-great-great-grandparent who did something terrible, and you're impacted by that. But again, you don't know the details of what that is, except through things like visions and dreams. So in the process, both texts reveal otherwise unknowable things, karmic past, or reasons for otherwise inscrutable strange behavior. Third point, genre. You cannot understand any religious text without considering the genre in which it's participating. And so not all genres are the same. One is diagnostic, it's a manual for practice. The other is descriptive, it's a selective account of one person's experience that grew directly out of his practice. Yet, the manual has its prescriptive force, as Michel Strickmann noted about such texts. It's as if you can, in other words, you can read a text like this Buddhist one as a manual for self-diagnosis, but you can also read it aspirational. Like you can see, oh, okay, under this sign, boy, this is really auspicious. If you dream this, it means your karma is humming, or you don't have anything. You're just on the cusp of breaking through to Buddhahood. And so, let me try to dream those dreams. Strickmann, he had such a great gift of writing. These are the best dreams. Dream these if you can. Of course, there's no method for guaranteeing that that's what you'll dream of, but anyway. And the description of experience in the young Daoist's case has normative force. In other words, if you too, say, reading that text, are on the path toward perfection, toward becoming a Junmen, a perfected being, as the young man Chotsu was, you are being warned here that this is what that quest could entail for you, and it costs you everything you have, and everything you were ever going there. And so you must steel yourself for that eventuality. Finally, I think in some sense, both texts represent attempts to bring dream experience, always potentially unruly, under some sort of order. And it's the unruliness of this that is part of the story I want to tell in this book. For example, in the Buddhist text, some dream signs evidence demonic attacks. And if you know that that's what the dream indicates, you can take measures. But it's also possible in the Buddhist scheme of things that some dreams are demonic attacks. They don't indicate anything. They're just Mara's attempt to throw you off course, mess with your head. You know, how do you know the difference? You don't. And so some dream content simply also just might not appear in the text. It's not as if this is a book that describes every possible dream phenomenon that anyone could have. It's 108 particular things. And I'm sure most people's dreams, most of the time, were simply not listed in this. And so then you're on your own. You had to resort to some other means. In the Daoist case, there's a continuity, profound continuity, as I said, between the young man's waking visions and his dream experiences. But there is no guarantee, in fact, it's almost certain, that Zhou Liang recorded all his dreams. So we get to see the set that he wanted us to see, in effect, or that he wanted his master to see, who then passed it on to the emperor. And at some point, somebody wrote this into some version of the Taoist canon, and there it sits for us to find. Now, there are all those writings that he burned, all the other dreams that he never wrote down at all. And the lessons were difficult, even costing him his life in this world. So the texts, I think, imply a hope, both of these texts and all these others that I'm going to be dealing with. They imply a hope that dreams could be domesticated. It's a hope surely continuously and repeatedly belied in actual experience, one way or another. But that is the nature of religious practice. You're always, in effect, striving to do what is not finally possible. Thank you all. I'm sorry, I'm a bit over time.
So, yeah, thanks, Rob. This was clear and stimulating. You know, when I think about dreams, I think in the post-Freudian era that any conversation about them always has to eventually evolve or devolve back to sex. And there's no indication of sexual dreams in the way you talked about this. So I'm curious, in the early modern state-of-the-art Chinese inventory of maybe, say, of Master Zhou's communications with PNC, are there a set of signs that are correlated with specifically sexual dreams, or is there a kind of unruliness to sexual dreams that doesn't correlate with the project of self-cultivation, and therefore they aren't recorded in that kind of inventory that those other dreams would be included in?
So you mean, you're talking about so you're not talking about dreaming of having sex. You're talking about dreaming of a chair, say, like where that dream is actually a signal that what you're really preoccupied with is sex and it's manifesting itself in your life.
No, I'm actually talking about actually dreaming of having sex, but in this through this sort of lens, that it would be seen as a sign of something else.
That's interesting because again, I have not, this is early days in this project. I confess I have not yet translated, for example, those 108 signs in the Buddhist text. But I don't think, I'd be very surprised to find in there that anyone is having a dream of having sex. And certainly in the Taoist case. And if in these kinds of contexts you dreamed of a sexual act, this is really bad news for you. I mean, that indicates a very serious problem that you must deal with. Now, as some of you know, in a lot of Buddhist Vinaya texts giving monastic rules for monastic life, there's a lot of discourse about what about stuff that you do in dreams that are stuff you're not supposed to be doing. Like if you're a monk, you're not supposed to be having sex. but you dream of having sex, or even worse, you have a nocturnal emission. That's a classic, I had a colleague once in Indiana who wrote a book on, what early medieval monks, like in Egypt and Syria, Christian monks, what they did about, nocturnal emissions. You're supposed to be living a celibate life, and you wake up and you realize you have, you've essentially carried out a solo sex act in your sleep. Is it a sin? What do you do about it? Similar discourse in the Buddhist world. Does that generate bad karma or not? And the answer is usually no karma is attached to dream activity. So the dream, that's why I say these texts are typically, in the Buddhist case, the dream operates at a meta level and indicates to you something about your past karmic state. It doesn't generate karma. It's a comment on your already existing. Now, there are probably texts somewhere else that I haven't even, it's not like I pretend to have read every account of or text about dreams in this long period. I'm sure somewhere there's probably texts that I haven't seen yet that will maybe allow me to give a better answer to your question. I don't know of texts where practitioners, full-time religious practitioners, are dreaming of having sex, except for those many verses. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah, right.
Thank you for the very teaching lecture. About going back to the early part of the talk, where you're talking about the passage to Lumbia, where Kunze is kind of thinking about the sages and that they appear, and also there are similar things in the Buddhist texts where all kinds of divinities appear in dreams and communicate something. What's the ontological status here? Are they projections of the mind? Are they actual divine beings? Or maybe that's not the right question, it's not for us to decide, but how that was understood, or was it tentative, nebulous, kind of uncertain, or multiple interpretation, or maybe it's difficult to include some kind of coherent, singular interpretation of this phenomenon because different sources might be indicating different things. Do you have any idea about that?
I do. Let's go back to this. So yes, there's dreams, and then there's the question of sort of ontological. What's actually going on? Is this a real contact? Is it just in your mind? Is it one of your multiple spirits has gone on a walkabout, left your body during sleep? This is a common, not the only, a common Chinese theory of what dreaming is. We have a set of multiple souls. When we're asleep, sometimes one of them slips out at night and kind of roams around and has various experiences. So that's the ontology there. So here you see a disagreement. Evidence, textual trace of sharp disagreement. Some people think these beings are actually appearing to you in spirit form, whatever that means, and you're having a face-to-face encounter with them. This text is positioning itself as saying, no, this is savvy people understand that these spirits aren't real. So what does it say? It's an alternative. It's not really a matter of spirits informing you, but of your own focus and immersion. So it's a mental phenomenon. You have generated by your own.
So this is a projection, but then if it's just you, so what's the point of some past sage talking? If it's just you have discussion, then you're just imagining it. It's just a fantasy of him. You're just talking to yourself. This goes back to this notion like when people pray or they have messages on audio, is it the echo chamber, or is it something? So what's the need then? If it's just, what's the need of the Duke of Zhou? If it's just Confucius talking to himself, thinking about it, figuring it out, and then continue to think and figure out, then why attribute some of it to other person if it's just himself?
I think the answer is, again, contained in both of these passages, that it matters because tentative and hesitant to claim that spirits actually exist. The point is we should act as if they do when we're offering sacrifice to them. I think that the point is it's an index of the sufficient intensity of your practice during the day. So if you stop dreaming like Zuko Joe, it means you're not working hard enough while you're awake. That's all. And I think the same idea applied here. If you focus and immerse yourself in your study, so if you Jing our shooter, then ghosts, spirits will come and inform you. And then this text itself tacks on the further note. It's not that the spirit is real. The idea is the dream experience of spirit visiting you and talking with you is like a thumbs up. You're working hard enough during the day. Keep going. And if you aren't having those kinds of dreams, it means you need to step up. That's what I think. But so I think your question brings up an important point that there was not a Chinese agreed upon ontology of any of this. It's a dreamscape. There are multiple possibilities, and sometimes you might see multiple possibilities operating in the same text at the same time, which I love. It's like we don't really know. We don't know now. Why do we dream, and what does it mean? There's lots of different schools of thought. So we think we figured everything out in this society, but we haven't. Yes.
Could you talk about these texts as a kind of curriculum for monks to get them to record their dreams? I'm just struck by the fact that everyone knows what they dreamt. And I'm sure I knew when I woke up this morning, but I didn't write it down, and now I have no idea. So I'm just struck by how transparent their dream lives are to them, and I'm wondering what kinds of practices that transparency might be associated with.
Well, first of all, I will say, I don't know about you, but there's been times in my life, and that's a long span of time because I'm like 120 years old, but there's been times in my life when I recorded my dreams for various personal purposes of a kind of self-cultivation, I suppose. It's called therapy, but which is, a kind of self-cultivation. But then there's been, most of the time, I have not bothered to record my dreams, and frankly, I don't usually see them as having any great importance, even to me, much less anyone else. Of course, another thing to say is that the dreams of which we have record, we have a lot of records of dreams, but that's not to say that everyone in society is always recording their dreams. All we can know is what people wrote down, and then from all the things they want to wrote down, what happened to it survived for us to read. You see what I mean?
Maybe
so there's like a vast ocean of dreams that not only human beings, but dogs, cats, octopuses have had, dolphins, fish. These creatures all dream. This is documented. But we don't know what their dream is, and they're just gone in the sea of time. I find that so beautiful and also disturbing.
Well, maybe I'll flip the question around. Do we have texts where people are frustrated by not being able to remember what they dreamt?
No. I shouldn't say no, but we don't have any that I can recall right now. It's not to say that they're not there. But I take your meaning, especially from this tip of the iceberg presentation. It might seem as though everyone was writing all their dreams down unfailingly all the time. And so there's this vast trove of dream records, and I don't think there's a reason to think that that's actually the case, unfortunately. Yes?
Yeah, could you say a little more about the nature of the self in these processes of self-improvement, transcendence, freedom? And are there markers between Taoist, the distinguished Taoist and Buddhist notions of what the self is, or do they really bleed into one?
So the beginning of your question, I don't hear very well. You said something, the word before the word itself. What was that?
In the processes of self-cultivation.
Self-cultivation.
What is the
nature
self?
of self. Well, that's a $5 million question. That varies, of course. by tradition, and even we can't assume that there was a single. I get so tired of scholars who really should know better by now, assuming that Taoists must have had a singular view of the self and a singular view of dreams. And then when they see that, oh, here's what seems to be a Taoist text, but another view of dreaming is implied, this can't be right. I mean, that's just crazy. How could any tradition with any length of time to it have a single idea of something as pervasive and common as dreaming, right? So you would expect multiplicity, and you would expect even that these various theories of the self and of dreaming might be mutually contradictory. This is common all over the world all the time. And so we see articles by learned, famous scholars saying, I'm going to outline the Taoist view of dreams, and I'm going to show, how it's not operating. Zhuangzi said that we're not supposed to dream. Sages don't dream. And so the official Taoist view of dreaming is that we're not dreaming, and so you're not supposed to dream. And so if you are dreaming, it indicates right out of the gate some kind of habit. Well, I don't think Zhou Ziliang would have agreed with that, or his teacher, and they were Taoists. So anyway, I get exercised by that. But so then you're asking me to talk about Taoist and Buddhist theories of the self.
Or just what is the self there? Yeah.
I would say, again, first, there are multiple theories probably in both of those traditions. The Taoist self, one common notion of the self that you see in Taoist texts is, I think of it as a kind of, it's a microcosm. It's a small version of the universe that has the various parts and functions and aspects of it correlate to things in the greater universe out there. It's like a confederation also of multiple, you install gods in yourself in various, in your head, in your torso, upper torso, lower torso. You move breath around in depots. It's like a transportation and storage system in there. You also have biospiritual parasites running around in there, and there's ways to detect that. There's measures to take to get rid of them. You're also, so that's like the kind of the internal composition of this thing. It's a multi-partite country made up of parts that are going in all different directions. Multiple souls, some of which leave your body at certain times. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. You can journey to the stars, that's a good thing. But if in dreaming, for example, your soul is wandering around, where it's not supposed to be, very bad thing for you, etc. It gets into all kinds of mischief. And that's before we've even got to like the social self. And then there's how you present yourself to others, your roles in a society, defined in part by your role, defined in part by what your relationship is to. So Zhou Ziliang, was a disciple. He was a son and a nephew. He was a brother. He was also like a tour guide on Maoshan. Visitors would come, just like visitors do now. He would be the one to have to schlep them around and, show them the sights of Maoshan and, take them to the temple. And he had a lot of jobs. Also, he was worried about his father's corpse, in an untended tomb hundreds of miles away that he was separated from by warfare and, the hostile takeover of the area of northern China where his father's remains were. And he was worried about that his entire middle life. What else could ultimately, I think the Taoist self, what you're grooming yourself for, is that ascension to the celestial court. And in one of his dreams, and this is one reason why I think dreams and self-cultivation is such a cool intersection to look at. Already in the dreams, he is performing the role of transcendent. And this is one thing that I was going to talk about, but I just left it out for lack of time. But we often think of these religious paths in medieval China as, we think of them in gradualist terms. Bodhisattva path, 10 stages. You don't get there in a leap. You have to go through 10 stages, and you can't skip any. Then, of course, Chan comes along and says, that's all. Just one moment. But the whole point of Chan's doing that is this very predominant view where that's not possible, and it's a gradualist process. But I think that by the same token, for example, take that Buddhist text. Many of the dreams, you are in a Buddhist assembly listening to the Dharma being preached. Or Zhou Liang's dreams. You're, in one of his dreams, he actually visits the celestial court of the divine Lao Tzu. It's like the embodiment of the Tao itself. So he's already been there in his dream. And if you're a Buddhist, one of your big problems in China is you're keenly aware that the Buddha down in India came and went many, many centuries ago, and you don't have direct access to the Buddha, except you do. Because if you dream of being preached to by him at night, you have gained access to him. And then we know there's all these techniques for trying to get up to have an interview with Maitreya, the next Buddha waiting in line to come down, and so forth and so on. So my point is that I think we often focus on the gradualist model in these religions, but that all the time there was also a kind of subitist model also, which I think of in performance terms. Zhou Liang was performing the role of perfected person, already here and now. Visualization is a common Shang Daoist practice. You visualize yourself multisensorily, not just vision, but you imagine that you're doing something in a divine way. As you are here in this world awake. And then that could carry over into your dreams and so on. So I have not talked about Buddhist ideas of self. There's certainly scholars in this room who could do a much better and faster job of that than I could. So let me just stop. I hope I've said enough to make you feel unfrustrated. Let me get someone in the back. Yes? Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that you had not finished translating the Buddhist text. So
I didn't really start except for a couple of passages.
Okay, so this question may be a bit premature. I don't know if you're at this stage in the research, but I was curious. You mentioned the possibility of a descriptive text like that being used kind of prescriptively to say, oh, it's intended for you to look up dreams you've already had, but someone might look at it and say, oh, I would like to have this dream. I'll try and have this dream. Do you have any evidence of how the text was actually used? Like, for example, do you see evidence of it being used like that, or do you see evidence of Buddhist monks who were preoccupied with their dreams in the way that Zhou Liang was, or was it used more occasionally, like if a practitioner has a particularly disturbing dream or a particularly good dream, and they think, oh, I really want to find out what this means. Let me consult this text.
Right. So good question. Thank you, Jesse. The classic problem of we have a prescriptive text. What do we know about whether anyone actually ever used it? Mm-hmm. And if so, what happened? That's always a big thing that we want to know. For this particular 108 sign manual, I do not yet have an instance. I just have the manual.
Right.
I do not yet have an instance of like an anecdote from, say, a monk's biography or something, where someone is shown consulting this text or anything like it after having had a dream.
Okay.
Now, I do have examples where someone has a dream and they go to their teacher, they go to their master, or they go to a fellow practitioner and they have a conversation about the dream. Those are not hard to find.
Right.
But I don't yet, I'm still early stages.
Right.
might be able to find one. I don't have examples of the deployment of this or any similar text in actual life. I will also say, though, that even if I can never find such a passage, it would be so great if I could, but even if I can't, I would push back that simply the making and circulating of such a text is already itself a mode of practice.
Right.
That text didn't just drop from the heavens, and then we're curious whether anyone actually used it. People made this text. They, and as you know, writing out copies of texts in a manuscript world was very, very laborious business. Every copy of every text had to be produced by hand because they were precious materials, precious objects in the world. And so the fact that, and enough copies of this apparently, obviously were made so that enough survived, to make it into the canon that we now have. That itself tells us something.
Right.
But I would like to know a lot more. I don't yet know. I'll let you know.
Thank you.
So this made me probably not the research you're doing. So you talk about the role and dynamic of the landscape pictures and stuff. I can see.
Can you speak up? And
Yeah, sorry. So you talk about the role of the dreamscape in the dynamic of self-efficacy, agency, and so forth through the lens of text. And I'm sure you could probably talk about the dreamscape and its relationships, other material culture like virtual objects, art. Do you see any of the dreamscape being reflected in more of the, more spatially in like physical, geographic sense in the religious landscape? Does that make sense? So maybe architecture or mapping or urbanism or just something a little bit outside of text or the classic visual objects.
yeah, I know everyone's so tired of hearing about text. To me, yeah, I'm not done working with text, but an example comes to mind. Dan Stevenson has an article in one of those Princeton volumes, Religions of X in Practice, edited by Don Lopez Jr. Visions of Manjushri on Mount Untai. So now these aren't dreams; they're waking visions. But so a monk whose name I forget, had visions, repeated visions of, that Manjushri wanted a monastery built for him on Mount Untai, and that eventually, after I guess many years and many efforts on the part of many people, and collecting of resources and solicitation of donations from wealthy lay donors, etc., that resulted in the construction of an actual monastery that matched the one he had seen in his vision or visions. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Can we think of examples where someone built something in the waking world that they had first seen or visited in a dream? That's a good question. Nothing comes to mind right now. Oh, it's time to shut up. But I'm going to find something. And what's your name?
Corbin.
Corbin? What's your last name?
No.
Corbin. Oh, right. So when I find it, I'm going to put it in there, and I'm going to have a footnote with your name. And Corbin, this is for you. I found an example. Here it is. Hope you enjoy it. Yes?
I'm just wondering about the way you're theorizing all of this. And when Jimmy introduced you, he, I think, as I recall, talked about the collective imagination, and which implies something singular about all of this. And you yourself use the word imaginaire without an S, and yet it's very clear that there's a plurality of things going on here. So we're talking about imaginaries. So there's this kind of slippage, it seems to me, between the gloss and the material. And at the same time, even the word image seems to be contradicted by some of the paradigms. I think, as I recall, you said, at least one of the paradigms is saying these aren't images, they're not correlates, they're sort of direct action, they're performative. So again, I wonder, is the word imaginary encompassing enough for all of this? And just to go back to the question that Corbin was asking too, I think of Castoriadis in his book, The Imaginary Constitution of Society, where he argued, Durkheim saw that images reflect social structure, right? Totemism reflects the nature of society. And Castoriadis was saying, well, it's actually the other way around. Society, I think that's what Corbin was sort of getting at, is are there things out there, material culture that reflects dreaming to show just the opposite. And it seems to me you've got a bunch of agents going around with different notions of the cosmos in order to come up with these different ideas. So whether it's image or not image, Castoriadis' idea of some kind of inventiveness or creativity is foundational to society here and foundational to the kind of social pluralism. And so I'm just wondering about how you theorize that with such rich material, how you think about the social context.
Very thoughtful. Challenging question, thank you. Where are you?
Joseph Help.
So yeah, I used a singular word, but to me, and maybe others who use this word disagree with this, and I guess I don't really care about that. I mean, I use imaginaire to just, as I said on some slide early on, I think it's a loose name for just the total set of things insofar as evidence survives for us to know about them. That people thought about dreams, did with dreams, types of stories they told about dreams, theories of dreaming, models of dreaming, results of dreaming, texts about dreaming, etc. All of that stuff I think of as a dreamscape. But this book that's coming out in October and this next book, very much the whole point of mapping the dreamscape is to show that different areas, different domains, or domains, city-states, as it were, on that dreamscape have very different notions of what dreams are and why they matter or don't matter. See what I mean? So the word is singular, but I don't intend, first of all, I don't think it's possible for someone like me to give a complete account of any of this stuff. So maybe I need to just find a different word, because if you're talking about the imaginary, maybe that sort of implies that you have all the pieces in place and you know how, every little bit of it looks, and I certainly don't think that. But so I'm trying to see them all together. Let me tell you one reason I think this is important. As I mentioned, some people have decided that, what comes first is a religious tradition, as we like to say. And every religion must have a unitary view of something like dreaming. And so it's a question of just taking a text, plugging it into that model. There must be a Taoist view of dreaming. Now I'm going to illuminate how that view of dreaming is played out or reflected in this or that text or whatever. What I see instead of that is a common dreamscape in China over this long period. And by common dreamscape, I don't mean everybody had the same idea of dreams. I mean there's an identifiable set of paradigms, or for lack of a better word, of ways in which people thought of dreams and interacted with them and regarded them and things they did in response to them and so on. And that common dreamscape underlies all the religious traditions during that period. It's the same dreamscape. So you have Buddhist texts, you have this paradigm, that paradigm, another paradigm. See? You have Daoist texts, even Confucian texts. People, we're still arguing whether Confucianism is even a religion or not. But meanwhile, we have all this evidence, and we've seen here, this is a text about Confucius as a master in history. So instead of sort of thinking and writing in a way where I'm seeing the distinct religions of China as silo-like containers, and then surprised that something seems to have jumped out of one of them or something, gotten loose and maybe ran into another container, I'm assuming from the start that we're going to find all of these models of dreaming all over the place. But the models of dreaming themselves are distinguishable. They're not all the same. Okay? So there's maybe multiplicity implied in the singular noun, and it's that multiplicity that I think is so interesting.
If I may,
Yeah.
you just used the word totality, and I'm wondering, isn't that what so many scholars of religion always end up doing, is totalizing things? Whether it's a distinct religion as some sort of demarcated, uniform set of things, or you're arguing for some sort of total landscape that subtends all of these traditions.
Subtend.
Well, but isn't it? If you if you went a step further, just given your evidence, then don't you have a really radical alternative way of thinking about all this as not a totality, but a kind of concert of radically plural forms of interpretation, all in a way at odds with each other and coexisting? And it just seems to me that there's maybe a third way.
Yes, that's exactly what you have, except my addendum would be, there's much variation, but there's not infinite variation. It's like, I used to work on, well, I still work on these stories of strange events. Okay? And at some point it dawned, I did like I created a motif index of all these different stories, different protagonists, different circumstances, different settings, different centuries, different ideologies. But there was a limited set of types of stories and types of roles of beings or figures operating in those stories. And it's that limited set of things that I tried to map in a motif index. So it's, yeah, there's variation all over the place, but there are also regularities observable in the variation. And sure, I'm happy to grant that and I think I say this explicitly in this October book, that I surely have missed some stuff. There's probably some material somewhere that I haven't considered here that would offer us an additional paradigm, or that would just maybe call into question the way that I've characterized one of my paradigms or whatever. I don't pretend to have summed all this up. So it's precisely, I'm interested in the creativity and the variety of human action and human performance and imagination in a culture over a long period of time, insofar as we can get at that from the evidence that survives. And I'm not trying to, in fact, I mean, the very image that I closed this October book with is Zhuangzi's famous butterfly dream parable. And I compare, it's like Zhuangzi, do you know this story? Okay. So Zhuangzi, the guy who supposedly wrote the book, says that he often speaks in the third person, and that probably because an individual man named Zhuangzi probably didn't write the book that we have, but in any case, that's another story. Zhuangzi, the character, one night dreamed he was a butterfly, flying around. He really felt like he was a butterfly. And then he woke up and he was Zhuangzi again. But now he wasn't so sure whether he was actually Zhuangzi, who had just dreamt he was a butterfly, or whether he was really a butterfly, now dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. But the story doesn't stop there. And then it says, between Zhuangzi and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. And then it closes with the line, this is the transformation. Okay, so I talk about this story in like my little epilogue to the book. And I'm like, this whole book is really about, I think, human attempts to bring under some kind of order, some understanding, a mode of experience, dreaming, that is ultimately not subject to any scheme of thinking. By definition, almost, it escapes any scheme. And the butterfly, that's why that image, whoever designed the cover at Harvard, this is Harvard University Asia Center Publications. They have a brilliant, I guess they farmed it out, contracted this work out, but the editor described what I'm doing in the book to an artist, I guess, and the artist came up with this image and it just blew me away. I'm like, this, please, I don't even know this person's name, but thank them profusely, because this perfectly captures the idea that you're trying to map something that is ultimately not liable to be mapped. And the butterfly escapes the net of the map and just goes flying off wherever it likes. And I say, just like these Chinese people with dreams, my book about the Chinese people and their dreams is also similarly limited. You can never capture it fully. And that's the beauty of it. Did I?
If there's no time.
We should close up.